Hello, everybody. This is going to be a quick video over the factors that have commonly and repeatedly been found to predict interpersonal attraction. And this includes not only romantic attraction, but very often it also predicts platonic attraction. So, who are we attracted to as a friend? So I'm going to share my screen with you. Kabloom. All right. Pull that to the side. Okay. So let's start here with some of the major predictors. And so when I say that these are major predictors, I mean they're major predictors in that they're consistent. They consistently predict whether or not someone's attracted to someone else. So just going down through the list very quickly, reciprocal liking simply refers to when your liking of someone else is reciprocated. So we tend to like those who like us. Proximity simply refers to physical or sometimes functional proximity. So when we are close to another person, and by close I don't mean emotionally close or anything like that. What I mean is literally close, meaning something about your day, where you live, where you work, something about your day brings you physically close to another person. We tend to be more interpersonally attracted. We tend to get into relationships, platonic and romantic, with those that we're around. Similarity. All right, similarity in fact is one of the most common predictors of interpersonal attraction. You have some people going so far as, basically treating it as almost a law. And certainly it is one of the most reliable predictors of attraction, both platonic and romantic. And we're going to talk about that more. We're going to talk about each of these a little bit more in a little bit. But I will say that the science seems to fly in the face of the conventional wisdom that opposites attract. Much to Paula Abdul's chagrin, no, opposites don't seem to attract. But we'll come back to that. And then finally, physical attractiveness. Now, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about physical attractiveness in this video because I've talked about it in other videos and I want you to go watch those. But physical attractiveness tends to be one of the most powerful predictors of attraction. It finds its way into some of these others, like, for example, similarity. Physical attractiveness tends to be one of the more influential and impactful predictors of who likes who. Now, I will say here, in just very briefly, and I want you to go watch my other videos about physical attractiveness, that there's a common conception that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and to some extent, that's true. All right, but largely there are universal norms in what is considered physically attractive. And when we look at standards of beauty across culture, what we tend to find is very rarely are there drastic shifts from the universally identified factors or universally identified attractive features. Usually what is considered attractive across the planet, and I can't think of a single variation of this, what changes within a culture and may not be seen as attractive in a different culture is usually some exaggeration of one of the universal features. So, again, go watch my video over what is physically attractive. Recognize that, yes, some of these, what people in each individual culture might identify as attractive will vary. It absolutely will, right? And what each individual might consider attractive will vary. It absolutely will. But usually we find in certain domains, certain things are found attractive across the planet. So when we talk about what is physically attractive, very often people will say, well, why does it even matter? Because everybody finds something different attractive. Kind of. When people say that, they're kind of right, but they're not as, the variation is not so wide that we can just say, well, nobody finds anything equally attractive, because that's could not be further from the truth. And I'll come back to that a little bit in this video, but again, I have other videos where I talk about what are those universal standards. So let's talk first about reciprocal liking. Now, when we talk about reciprocal liking, we specifically mean dyadic reciprocal liking. So we like other individuals who like us. So two people, dyadic, two people who like each other tend to reciprocate the liking. All right. So if I find that, an individual likes me, that inclines me to like them. Now, can that lead to a sustained relationship? Well, if that's all, if that's all a couple has, then no. All right. Simply liking one another probably won't do the trick in the long run. But if it sets up a situation where other factors in the list that we've talked about develop, then they can. So, reciprocal liking by itself won't do much. But if it sets up a stage where people can see, oh, hey, we're similar to one another, right? Then what started as reciprocal liking morphs into something else. And that other thing, the similarity, for example, can lead to a sustained relationship. So reciprocal liking by itself is just enough to get people started having a relationship. Again, platonic or romantic. And in fact, in some research examining interpersonal attraction in a speed dating context, reciprocal liking and physical attractiveness were bigger predictors than others. Now, in speed dating research, the proximity effect gets largely taken out because you're in a speed dating context, and so you're already seeing each other. You're already in close proximity. So proximity can't be very influential in those contexts. But among the remaining ones, reciprocal liking, similarity, and physical attractiveness, when you're first meeting somebody, reciprocal liking and physical attractiveness tend to be a little bit more consequential in the short term. Let's go on. And talk about proximity. All right. So sometimes if you go on and you read more about the effect of proximity on interpersonal attraction, you might come across the term the propinquity effect. This simply refers to the fact that, or the tendency for people to be attracted to those who are physically close. All right. So in some of the earliest research concerning the propinquity effect, they looked at friendships in dormitories. All right, so a lot of this was done before the internet, but they would look at student friendships and where those individuals lived relative to one another in the dormitories. And what they found is that people were far more frequently friends with people on the same floor of their dormitory than they were to be friends with people on different floors of their dormitory. But it's not just a matter of absolute proximity. Other things can bring us closer to one another, like work. So certain activities bring us closer to one another, and that creates functional proximity. So some function, something that we're doing, brings us closer to one another. And when that happens, that functional proximity allows for the mechanisms that to take effect. And the mechanisms I'm referring to here are specifically the mechanisms that allow proximity to increase interpersonal liking. And we'll come back to that here in a second. So actual proximity is important, and functional proximity is important. For going back to functional proximity, remember that in some of the earliest research, they found in the dormitories that people were more likely to be friends with people on the same floor of the dormitory. Well, people who had rooms at the base of stairwells or outside of mail rooms tended to have friends from different floors of the dormitory more often than those who had rooms away from stairwells and mail rooms. Well, why? Well, if you have a room near a stairwell, people are coming down those stairs. So more people are coming by your dorm. So you have more chances of interacting with them, more chances of seeing them. If you have a dorm next to a mailroom, well, and people, I don't know how frequently mailrooms are used today, but before texting and all the electronic mail that we have, um, to get your mail, you'd have to go to the mailroom. So having a dorm outside the mailroom meant people were coming by your dorm more often. So the functional, the location of the dorm to some functional entity, the mailroom, the stairwell, brought people in close proximity. So actual proximity can make people more likely. We tend to be friends with people that we are actually close to, and those who, whatever, various functions that we have, various activities that we engage in, we tend to be friends with those who also engage in those activities or also go to those places. So, I'm more likely to be a friend with someone that I work with than someone, that, I live next to, but have no reason to interact with them. All right. Because yeah, I live close to them, but the functional proximity that I have with someone I work with leads me to be more likely to interact with them. Now, why is it that proximity leads to liking? Am I going to be friends with my neighbors? Well, you're not going to. It's not deterministic. It's not like, well, I live next to these people, I'm going to be friends with them now. It's not that cut and dry. All right. Rather, proximity simply allows or increases the chances of other things happening, specifically exposure. All right. When we're close to someone, the chances of us bumping into them and interacting with them go up. And this is part of the reason why functional proximity can be more influential than actual proximity, right? Because if I'm going to work, the people I work with, I'm probably going to bump into them more. I'm probably going to talk to them more. I'm probably going to be exposed to them more. All right. So functional proximity can be more influential than actual proximity because it can provide greater reasons for exposure. Now, once you've been exposed to something, exposure breeds familiarity. We tend to like things that we've been exposed to a lot, right? You probably think about music, right? Think about the music that your parents used to listen to, okay, when you were younger. Chances are you kind of like that music. So, for example, my folks, I was raised by my grandparents, and they listened to classic country, Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Conway Twitty, and I love that stuff. I still love it. I don't like modern country music. It just doesn't do it for me. But classic country music, man, I'm all about that. Well, why? Well, probably because I was exposed to it a lot as a child. And so it bred familiarity, leading me to like it more. All right. And so there you have the mechanisms whereby, uh, proximity can lead to liking. If you're close by it, you're more likely to be exposed to it. And simply being exposed to something can breed familiarity, which breeds liking. And that simple effect of being exposed to something leading to greater familiarity and liking, that's known as the mere exposure effect. And we don't even necessarily need to be aware that we've been exposed. So, for example, in some work by Zients. His name is spelled in a way that doesn't seem like it should be pronounced Zients. It's Zajonc. It looks like it should be pronounced Zajonc. But Zients is the one who identified or coined the term mere exposure effect and identified and did a lot of the research examining it. And in some of his research, he found that even subliminally presenting participants with images made them like those images later more than images that they had not been subliminally presented with. So, and remember, when something is subliminally presented to us, we're not aware of having seen it. So even when we're not aware of the exposure, things that we are exposed to seem more familiar, and we like those things more. So simply being around other people and be exposed to them can influence us. One of a classic study examining the effect of proximity on interpersonal liking simply manipulated how many times a confederate, somebody working for the participant, sat in a class across a semester. Those confederates that sat in a class more often were liked more than those who sat in a class less often. So again, more than likely, I mean, think about, when you're, in a class, right? Do you talk to everybody in the room? No. All right, you might talk to the people right next to you, but very rarely do you talk to somebody who sits on the other side of the room. So just being in the room doesn't necessarily imply that you're going to interact, but being in the same room means you are exposed, right? And so simple, mere exposure can breed familiarity. When you're around other people, proximity, that increases mere exposure. All right. Now, let's move on to similarity. Now, I've got a word there that seems a little weird. Homophily. All right. It means liking the same. And we do. We like similarity. So, in what ways do we like similar others? Well, we like people who are similar to us in at least 4 ways. Demographically, so people of the same social economic status, sex. There's research showing that racial similarity. We tend to like people who are similar to us in on certain demographic variables. Another way we seem to like people is in terms, or similar people, is in terms of experiences. All right, so people who share our experiences, we tend to like them more. We also seem to like people who are similar to us in physical attractiveness. Remember, I said physical attractiveness finds its ways into some of the other factors predicting liking. Well, it affects physical attractiveness plays into similarity. People tend to get into relationships with people who are about as attractive as they are, or a little bit more attractive. So people of similar attraction tend to group together. They tend to pair together. And this is known as the matching principle. All right. Specifically, the tendency for people to get into relationships with, become friends with similarly attractive people is known as the matching principle. So we like people who are demographically similar. We like people who share our experiences, so they have similar experiences. We like people who are similarly attractive. But the lion's share, the vast majority of research on the similarity to similarity effect comes from research examining attitudinal similarity. And so what I mean by that, you remember us talking about attitudes, similar evaluations. So do you like the same things? Do you dislike the same things? Liking among people seems to be a pretty strong linear effect of similarity. And what do I mean linear effect? Well, what I mean is that as similarity between two people grow, liking between those two people seems to grow about the same. Now, we I mentioned earlier in the video that, you know, reciprocal liking and physical attractiveness uh, are a little bit more consequential earlier on, and there's evidence to support that. But there's also evidence to support that similarity does play a role early, but not actual similarity. Because again, similarity, real similarity, takes some time to establish. Like if I meet you for the first time, I don't know, as my granny would say, I don't know you from Adam. So we can't know similarity when we first know people or when we first meet people. We know how physically attractive they are, all right? Within a few minutes of talking to someone, we can tell whether or not we like each other. Goodness, we'd probably figure out whether or not we kind of like each other based on physical attractiveness, all right? So just looking at a person, you can get a little bit of that physical, you can get an evaluation. You can get some liking based on physical attractiveness, and you can get some reciprocal liking, but you can't really establish actual similarity just by looking at somebody. You can get a little bit of it maybe, right? So do they groom themselves the same way you do? Do they wear the same kinds of clothes? You know, things like that. You can look at superficial features, some of that demographic stuff we were talking about. But with attitudinal similarity, you can't really establish that at first glance. But what you can do is establish perceived similarity. And indeed, there's work showing that people tend to think that attractive others, physically attractive others, which you can establish, right, just by looking at somebody, people tend to think that physically attractive others are attitudinally similar. They think that they have similar evaluations to what they have. And so perceived similarity can have an effect pretty early in a relationship, all right? Now, if we're talking about actual attitudinal similarity, it usually has to have an effect later on. Now, Byrne, one of the earliest researchers to identify the similarity effect, argued that we first go through this phase of weeding out dissimilar others, and then among those who are left, we tend to clump together with those who are more similar. So, you know, you identify who's a member of, put in terms of groups, you might say that you identify who's a member of your group, and then among those members of your group, you cling to those who are closer to you. Similarity, actual attitudinal similarity, seems to be more consequential later on in the relationship. Perceived similarity seems to be more influential in the early steps. But some research suggests that the impact of perceived similarity never really goes away. In fact, one meta-analysis seemed to suggest that satisfaction in relationships seems to be more strongly predicted by perceived similarity between relationship partners than actual similarity. So it appears that although similarity is important, it seems that very often perceived similarity is more influential than actual similarity. And perceived similarity can be impactful right from the get-go. But certainly there's evidence to suggest that it also is influential later in the relationship. All right? Okay, so there we go. We've talked about all four of some of the more consistent predictors. Now, before I do a wrap up, I do want to make a few final comments on the factor that I didn't emphasize in this video, because I emphasized it in other videos, and that's physical attractiveness. And I think I say some of this in that other video. Are there universal standards of beauty? And when I mean standards, I mean, are there things that people find universally attractive? One seemingly resounding answer to that question is yes, absolutely. So is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Kind of. And again, I address that more in a different video. But what I'll just leave here, what I'll simply say here, is that regardless of the fact that physical attractiveness does vary across country to some across culture to some extent, and across person to some extent, there are large consistencies. And regardless of those two facts, that there are huge consistencies across the planet, across every person, and yes, there is variation among them, regardless of that, physical attractiveness seems to be one of all the four factors that we've talked about, one of the most influential factors. In fact, I would argue, especially early in a relationship, it's the most important. More than likely, we're probably not going to, we don't have information about people when we see them for the first time. Literally, the only information that we have is how they look. And so literally the only information we have about a person is how physically attractive they are at first. And now as the relationship progresses, certainly these other things become important, like similarity, right? First, and if we look at the time course of a relationship, after you get into a relationship, after you start talking to somebody, you can establish some reciprocal liking, right? And then after that, you can establish some actual similarity, right? But physical attractiveness, especially in the early stages of a relationship, is very important, potentially the most important. And what's more is that for some folks, it never goes away. The importance of physical attractiveness never goes away. In fact, some research suggests, at least for men, their relationship satisfaction seems to be somewhat tied to how physically attractive they find their spouses to be. So for some people, physical attractiveness never stops being important. Now, is it the only thing that people judge their relationship partners on? Well, certainly once the relationship has begun, no. Physical attractiveness is by no means the only thing that they're judging their partner on. And by no means is it the only thing affecting their relationship satisfaction. But it can be a factor influencing their satisfaction. Okay, so early in the relationship, it's probably the most important factor. As the relationship ages, it becomes less and less important, but it always remains somewhat important. All right, guys, that is it for this video over the common factors predicting attraction. And again, everything that I've talked about, including physical attraction, everything I've talked about seems to work or seems to be important for both platonic and romantic attraction. All right, guys. As always, if you have any questions, send them my way. If not, have a great week, and I'll see you later.